This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous. Right now, decisions with irreversible consequences are being made faster than facts can catch up. Not behind closed doors, in public, in fragments, in hints, in half sentences. Power is moving before anyone is required to explain what comes next. You're told this is precaution. You're told this is restraint. You're told this is temporary. But systems don't drift like this by accident. They slide, slowly, then suddenly. And once they do, they don't ask permission from the people living inside them. If you're watching this thinking, asterisk, I'll catch up later, asterisk, that's the mistake this system counts on. Stay with me, just for a few minutes. Because what's happening now isn't the event, it's the setup. And once the mechanism is in motion, stopping it becomes much harder than starting it. What actually controls this system now is not outrage, and it's not ideology, it's tempo. Speed has become the governing force. The faster a decision moves, the less resistance it encounters, the less scrutiny it absorbs. The fewer people are allowed inside the room before it's already happening. This is how power changes shape without announcing itself. You're watching military posture treated like messaging, warnings issued without definitions, consequences implied without timelines, action hinted at, then denied, then hinted at again. Not because anyone is confused, but because confusion is useful. When information arrives fragmented, accountability can't assemble fast enough to stop momentum. And momentum, once it starts, becomes its own justification. This is not chaos. This is a system optimized for movement over meaning. And here's the part that matters. Once speed becomes the organizing principle, no single leader has to fully own the outcome. Responsibility dissolves into process. That's the frame. And once you see it, you start to notice how long this shift has been underway. Because it didn't start this week, it was normalized quietly. There was a time when escalation required friction, deliberation, debate, time. Before, movement itself was the signal that something extraordinary was happening. Troops moved after explanations. Pressure followed justification. The system slowed itself down on purpose. Now, watch the contrast. Today, movement comes first. Explanations are optional. Sometimes they never arrive at all. Personnel shift. Assets reposition. Warnings circulate. All described as routine. All framed as precaution. Nothing on paper crosses a line. That's the shift. Slow change is the most dangerous kind because it teaches you to stop reacting. When escalation looks administrative, it stops feeling urgent. When threats sound procedural, they stop sounding like threats. This is how the extraordinary becomes background noise. The system learned that if you move gradually enough, no single moment triggers resistance. There is no headline big enough to stop it, no vote dramatic enough to interrupt it, and by the time people realize something fundamental has changed, the mechanism is already in place. What comes next is the first visible crack, not the cause, just the symptom. Then the system produces something that looks like a crisis. A sudden warning, a quiet withdrawal, personnel moved out, not because something has happened, but because something times might asterisk. This is the moment you're meant to notice. Bases adjusting posture, allies placed on alert, civilian infrastructure mentioned in the same breath as military assets, all of it described as precautionary, all of it carefully stripped of drama. Here's why that matters. When systems prepare for violence without admitting it, they transfer risk downward. On to service members who don't get to decide timing. On to host countries that didn't choose escalation. On to civilians who are never briefed, only exposed. Nothing has been announced. Nothing has been confirmed. And yet, lives are already being rearranged around a possibility. That's not deterrence. That's pre-impact. If this feels familiar, it should. Because this is how modern crises announce themselves now, not with declarations, but with logistics. Stay with me. Because what looks like caution is actually the signal that the mechanism has engaged. And once it does, it doesn't stop on its own. Here's the mechanism that makes all of this work. Uncertainty is not a side effect. It's the tool. By keeping outcomes undefined, the system protects itself from accountability. No red lines are formal, no endgames are stated. Action can always be framed as response, never initiation. If things go wrong, responsibility diffuses across statements, briefings, allies, and time. This is how damage is absorbed without a decision ever being named. Those at the top retain flexibility. They can advance, pause, reverse, threaten again. Nothing locks them in. Meanwhile, the cost accumulates elsewhere in regional stability, in civilian fear, in soldiers placed on alert for reasons they are not told. Someone benefits from this asymmetry. Someone always does. The advantage flows upward. The risk flows outward. And because the system never formally declares intent, it never has to answer for consequences in real time. By the time outcomes are visible, the narrative has already moved on. That's why the next moment matters. Because when pressure builds inside a structure designed to delay responsibility, it doesn't release cleanly. It breaks somewhere else. Now it accelerates. Faster statements, shorter timelines, less clarity. Warnings multiply, then overlap. Allies hear one version, the public hears another. Officials insist nothing is imminent while quietly preparing for exactly that. Movement speeds up. Explanation slows down. This is the danger zone. Because once multiple actors start reacting to signals instead of facts, the system stops being directional. It becomes reflexive. Every precaution looks like a provocation to someone else. Every denial sounds temporary. You don't need a decision for escalation anymore. You just need momentum. And momentum feeds on itself. At this stage, nobody has to choose war. They only have to avoid choosing restraint. And restraint, in a system built on speed, starts to look like weakness. That's when the smallest action carries the largest consequences. A misread signal, a delayed message, a move taken just in case. This is how crises tip, not with intent, but with timing. And the next part is where the cost stops being abstract. This is where it reaches you, not as policy, not as strategy, as disruption. Because when systems like this accelerate, they don't stay contained. They ripple outward into everyday life in quiet, invasive ways. Travel warnings, market volatility, energy prices, families watching loved ones deploy without answers, citizens living near bases suddenly calculating distance, not ideology. You are not consulted. You are adjusted around, and you're told this is for stability, that this is to prevent something worse. But prevention without transparency feels exactly like danger when you're the one absorbing the uncertainty. Here's the part that rarely gets said out loud. Systems that rely on ambiguity require public attention to lapse. They function best when you are tired, distracted, willing to assume someone else is tracking the consequences. That's why staying with this matters. Not because you can stop it tonight, but because systems like this only harden when nobody is watching closely enough to name them. Hold that thought. Because once this dynamic spreads beyond one region, it stops being optional. Once this spills outward, it stops being regional. Allies recalibrate quietly. Markets price in risk they can't quantify. Diplomats hedge language because certainty is now a liability. When one system normalizes escalation through ambiguity, others adapt or absorb the shock. Host nations inherit exposure without control. Trade routes feel pressure before policy changes. Energy corridors tighten. Insurance premiums rise. None of this makes headlines at first. It shows up as friction, delay, cost. And globally, something else happens. Other governments take notes. They see how power moves without declarations, how force can be implied without commitment, how uncertainty itself becomes leverage, and they begin to mirror it, not out of malice, out of survival. That's how a local posture shift becomes a global pattern. The rules don't break. They thin And once enough systems operate this way, predictability collapses, deterrence weakens, everyone prepares for everything, which means everyone is always closer to the edge than they admit. This is the moment where the future stops being theoretical, because from here, there are only a few directions left. From here, the system accelerates into 3 possible paths. The first looks reasonable. Adjustment. Institutions adapt to speed. New norms form. Ambiguity becomes permanent but managed. Risk is priced in. People live with a higher baseline of tension because it's survivable. For now, the second is quieter. Erosion. Each unresolved episode weakens trust a little more. Allies hedge further. Civilians disengage. Oversight lags permanently behind action. Nothing collapses. It just stops holding the way it used to. The system still functions, but only barely, and only until it doesn't. The third is the one no one schedules. Rupture. That's when a move made just in case collides with another one made the same way. When ambiguity runs out faster than momentum. When a system built to delay responsibility is forced to absorb consequences all at once. No one chooses this path in advance. They arrive there because every other decision felt smaller at the time. Which path this system takes isn't decided by one leader or one moment. It's shaped by how long acceleration goes unchecked. And that brings us to the part that cannot be resolved tonight. This is the part where people usually ask for reassurance. You won't get it here. Because systems like this don't announce when they've crossed the line. They only reveal it in retrospect when the cost is already sunk and the choices have narrowed. Nothing you've seen so far requires a declaration. Nothing demands a vote. Nothing forces clarity. And that's the warning. If you're waiting for a moment that looks unmistakable, you will miss it. The danger isn't a sudden decision. It's a process that teaches everyone to accept movement without meaning. This doesn't end with a headline. It continues with attention. If you stop watching, the system doesn't slow down. It speeds up. Because friction disappears when scrutiny does. So stay with this story. Follow the mechanics, not the personalities. Question the pace, not just the outcome. Because the next escalation won't arrive as a shock. It will arrive as something that feels familiar. And by the time it feels familiar, it's already working. If you want to understand where this goes next, don't look for comfort. Look for the next move before it's framed as inevitable.